الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا وسندنا وشفيئنا محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا آمنوا بالله ورسوله صدق الله العظيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك وارحم على عبدك ورسولك سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي كما صليت وباركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. So this was one slide that, if you remember, that yesterday I discussed with you, but I wasn't able to show you. So today's topic, just so I will read that for you once, is religiosity in irreligious times, aspiring to piety and spirituality in an age of illiberal secularism and Islamophobia in civil society. So this is a very loaded, long topic. But basically, the whole session is going to unpack and explain every word in this topic and its interrelation to one another. All right? So this is what I'll be doing today. And I actually think that even most of the afternoon session I'll be able to talk about today. And in the afternoon, I hope to get to some of your leftover questions from day 1 and day 2. Because I remember when they came, actually, alhamdulillah, 99% of them were on topic. And so they should be addressed. All right? So we'll have a bit of a longer question and answer session today, inshallah. Okay. Let me explain maybe a little bit to you. Obviously, there have been many periods in human history where you could say it was an irreligious age. In fact, this is the whole philosophy in Deen of Islam, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continually sent different successive Anbiya, Mursaleen, prophets and messengers, alayhim assalam ajmain. And the Islamic narrative of human history is that obviously it begins with Nabi Adam alayhi salam. He was not just the first human being, but the first Nabi, and he would have guided humanity. Then at some point humanity would have gone astray, would have forgotten those core beliefs, forgotten about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, forgotten about God, oneness of God, hereafter, life after death, morality, virtue, spirituality, worship, etc. Then Allah ta'ala would send another prophet, right? And then this cycle continues. Then there were some communities in history that got multiple prophets simultaneously, like Musa alayhi salam, Harun alayhi salam, and then if you remember from your Surah Baqarah, the Bani Israel had many, many prophets whose names aren't mentioned, and some of those prophets were killed as well, martyred, all right? And then, however, you also have very large gaps between prophets, and perhaps the most pronounced in that is the 600 plus years gap between Nabi Isa alayhi salam and Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So all of this sort of meshes with the Islamic philosophy of history I mentioned. I was told to speak closer because they can't hear downstairs, but then upstairs it becomes a problem. What I told you the other day is that the deen, which is the core beliefs, stay the same, but it is the laws and specific aspects of the way to observe worship, whether laws of worship, laws of marriage and divorce, laws of what is permissible to eat, that evolved over time, okay? Because humanity was in a stage of evolution. Now, as humanity as a race, as a species rather, is in its infancy, it needs more tarbiyah. That is why more prophets used to come historically. Sometimes, as I told you, communities had multiple prophets. As humanity as a species evolves and progresses and matures, less prophets come together, more of a gap comes in between prophets, and the very last, second to last, is Nabi Isa alayhi salam, right? And you can see the long gap between him, 600 plus years, between Nabi Isa alayhi salam and Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And then you can see in the three Abrahamic faiths, yani Nabi Musa alayhi salam, original Judaism, which is also Deen of Islam, Nabi Isa Islam, original Christianity, which is also Deen of Islam, and obviously Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you can see very similar features, right? Now it's not so different. A lot of things are very similar. Actually, traditionally, for example, original Jewish women, original Christian women used to cover their hair and always wear clothing up to their wrists and ankles and loose clothing, etc. Okay? All right. So that was one notion. So irreligious times historically meant that, okay, when the times became very irreligious, Allah Ta'ala would send another Nabi. But as we mentioned to you yesterday, and as all of you already know, Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is Khatam al-Nabiyyin. He is the absolute last and final prophet and messenger. So after his prophethood, whenever and wherever irreligious times may come, where there's communities of people who are not religious, whether you want to call that secularism, you want to call that atheism, you want to call that modernism, you want to call that liberalism, now, for the first time in human history, the response to irreligiosity will not be that Allah Ta'ala sends another prophet and messenger. For the first time in human history. So that means that the irreligious times will not be corrected in that sense. And in fact, irreligiosity will continue and continue and continue until it descends into absolute chaos, which is the fitnas of the trials and tribulations of the end of time, and ultimately the coming of the ultimate irreligious figure known as the Dajjal. Alright? At that point then, Allah Ta'ala will send back Nabi. First there will be Imam Mahdi, right? And then after that, from within the Ummah, the Muslim Ummah, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then will send back Nabi Isa alayhi salam. Alright? And then that will be the final push back against the irreligiosity. Then there will be some time when religion, spirituality, peace, justice will prevail on the entire earth. And then again it will start gradually. Just then after Imam Mahdi passes away, Nabi Isa alayhi salam then has his proper death, which he didn't have originally because he was lifted up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then again humanity will decline until again it declines into abject irreligiosity, and then the response to that will not be another prophet coming. The response to that will not be the second coming of another prophet. The response to that will be Israfil blowing the horn and calling an end to all the physical worlds and universe. Alright? So I've given you a brief overview of the Islamic narrative of history. All right. So then we are living in that first part, which I told you, is that the world will become irreligious. We haven't reached that far yet about Imam Mahdi and Dajjal. Not going to be another prophet, obviously. Khatam al-Nabiyyin sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we are in a special time, right? And at the same time, those of us who are believers, we want to be religious. We want to have taqwa and try to be salihin and muttaqeen and dhakirin, mu'minin. But we're living in a time like that. So it's a particular special challenge. Alright? Okay. So this is for that person who wants to aspire to piety and spirituality. And this is something that practicing believing Christians also discuss. Obviously because a large segment, obviously there are Christians in Africa and Asia as well, but a large segment of the Western world is at least nominally made of majority Christians. And by and large, the Western world has moved away from religion, right? So they also have similar discussions on how to be religious in irreligious times. So this discussion itself is not exclusive to Islam, all right? And there again, like I did for you in the very first day, there will be things that are shared, and so we can call that the neutral, common, shared perspective. And there will be certain things about this discussion that are particular and specific to Islam. And we will call that the Islamic perspective. All right. Then I use this term illiberal secularism. This is one of my personal terms. I've long been meaning actually to write an article on this. This is a particular feature. It's actually not there in the West. I've never encountered this in the US and Canada. There are certain right-wing forces in the US and Canada, no doubt, that are illiberal. But I wouldn't really call them secular. And they may not necessarily be religious, but a lot of them, unfortunately, hijack Christianity. And a lot of their very good, believing, practicing Christians in America have nothing to do. This is also a myth, by the way, I should explain to the people in Pakistan. Do not think that all the Christians in America support Donald Trump and all the secular Americans are Democrats. It's not that simple. And there are actually a lot of very practicing, believing, ardent, conservative Christians who are abhorred by Donald Trump. All right? So there also, it's not so simple. And just like that, in Pakistan, it's not so simple. Right? Irreligiosity doesn't equal liberalism, and religiosity does not equal illiberalism. This is a false myth propagated by a lot of the English-educated elite media and particular professors in academia, professor of humanities and social sciences in Pakistani academia. This is actually not true, right? But I will be coming to that in a little bit. Illiberal secularism means a secularism that has no tolerance for religion. A secularism that preaches, advocates, even calls for pluralism, but in that grand tent of pluralism gives no space for religion. And so in that sense, they're illiberal. As far as accommodating other strands of secularism or other strands of irreligiosity, they're very liberal. And they'll say multicultural citizenship and everything. But if there's anything that has a source in religion, they want it out. So the greatest place where you find this particular type of illiberal secularism is continental Europe. Not really the US or the Canada or UK, continental Europe. And in fact, these some of these smaller countries, so for example, they'd like to ban the hijab, right? They like to ban circumcision. They ban minarets. Switzerland at one point banned minarets. I mean, what is minaret? It's just an architectural, it's just a, it's an extremely, profoundly illiberal thing to do when churches and cathedrals have spires, right? And I mean, what is architecture? What does that have to do with anything? True original liberalism is about values and ideas. It has nothing to do with symbols. True liberalism, John Stuart Mill's liberalism, would have no problem with hijab, would have no problem with minarets, would have no problem with circumcision. All right? So this is illiberal. This is not liberal. But it's being done in the name of secularism. That's how the French, especially the French, they have a particular intense word in Arabic, laïcité, which is like a very intense type of secularism. All right? Similarly, it has happened in the Muslim world, historically, Kemal Ataturk, right? So there were many, and I think any of you know a little bit about the history of the modern Republic of Turkey and who Kemal Ataturk was. Again, in the name of secularism, many things in religion that true liberalism has no problem with were removed. All right? So I think now you're getting an idea of why I coined this term, illiberal secularism. Interestingly, about 10, 15 years ago, there was a seminal article that was published in Foreign Affairs, if I'm not mistaken, called Illiberal Democracy. And that's where I came up with this title, Illiberal Secularism. Illiberal Democracy was a piece written arguing that Muslim political parties, those who try to contest elections through the party system, they're not truly democratic. They're actually making use of the democratic method to gain power, but they're actually illiberal. So this was written, for example, about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or about the party in Tunisia. Khair. So there was this warning, right? That, because for the West, democracy and liberalism and secularism and capitalism, these are the four. There's like a trinity in Christianity. I don't know what the word would be. This is the quadrilateral holy grail. Democracy, liberalism, secularism, and capitalism. And so they felt there was a definite and necessary connection between democracy and liberalism. But then they realized that there may be Muslims who have political parties, but their sort of party platform, party manifesto is actually has an Islamic element to it, has a religious element to it. And they found that abhorrent, right? So I think you understand what illiberal secularism is now. The next word I've put here, if you see, I'm just sort of doing the title, so you know what's coming, that's Islamophobia. Islamophobia is a relatively new term that has been used, at least I've seen its use in the American context, and that is sort of the Islamic parallel to anti-Semitism, the Islamic parallel to racism, right, against the African American community. And the notion is phobia to create a fear. So you have, some of these real, very small, there are very few of them. They're in extreme rural areas of America, random places like Arkansas or Nebraska. Some random quack nut job who tries to say Sharia law is coming to America. And they actually try in the courts, and you can see this, they've actually tried in American courts to have the courts pass some type of resolution that don't let Sharia law come to America. I mean, there's no even concept of that coming, right? So that's just fear-mongering. That's trying to create a hype, using hype to create a hysteria, a phobia about Islam, right? Okay? And this was done with immigrants who were coming. Maybe one of the most recent cases you can see is when there was a caravan of entirely 100% oppressed or disadvantaged or poor people coming from Honduras and El Salvador, and maybe a few people who were just seeking a better life economically, and they were marching towards the United States and Mexican border. Donald Trump said, oh, there must be some Middle Easterners amongst them, and that's why we have to, right, whatever, seal the border. Now, there's no sense that they're Middle Easterners, even randomly anywhere in Honduras or El Salvador, let alone that they're trying to sneak in as part of that caravan. But this is called Islamophobia. This is trying to create exploit the feeling of fear, right? So I think you have an idea what Islamophobia is. Civil society, if just maybe some of you don't know, so one is the government, the state itself, right? So the state has different organs. There's the executive, the bureaucracy, the parliament, the judiciary. So all of that would be called the state. Then there's civil society, which are basically actors. They would, for example, in Pakistan, that would be your industrialists, your feudal landowners. I mean, for better or for worse, they are people who have a power and influence in this country. They're also your journalists and media. They're the professors. They're different types of professionals, such as doctors, corporate, the entire corporate sector. All of this loosely forms civil society. Then there are particular organizations, civil society organizations, which might be think tanks, research institutes, NGOs, non-government organizations, foundations, charities, etc., etc. In certain Muslim countries, including Pakistan, there are even many civil society groups or organizations that also have Islamophobia. So like Lahore Grammar School or Beacon House, they actively don't even allow students who wear hijab, women students who wear hijab. There was a case in Karachi Grammar School that was brought to my attention about a woman, a young, A-levels, 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old girl who wanted to do niqab, and she was denied admission on this basis, right? And in America, actually Karachi Grammar School would be sued and taken to court and would have been required by the court to allow her in America and Canada. In Germany and France, the case would have gone to court, and Germany and France would have decided on the side of Karachi Grammar School. All right? So you get an idea of things, right? But how is it that Pakistan, Karachi Grammar School, has gone all the way up to the level of Germany and France? It has taken out US, UK, and Canada. So it means there is some serious illiberal secularism and very, very a lot of hostility and antagonism to religion. Any manifestation or expression of religion, any non-violent, non-threatening expression of religion in segments of civil society here, all right? And it counters the teachings of liberalism. Liberalism would teach Karachi Grammar School that you should admit her purely on the basis of merit, because you're an educational institute. Not all. There are other educational that have fee-based admissions, but you have a claim and you actually have a practice that other than the case of niqab and maybe other than some general's daughter, I don't know, right? But 99% you do follow merit-based admissions, right? And here you left your virtuous, ethical practice of merit-based admissions in an act of illiberal Islamophobia. And you did it in the name of secularism. All right? So now I think I've explained the whole title to you very well. So what does that woman do? If she's aspiring to piety and spirituality, what should she do? Should she remove her niqab in order to get admission to Karachi Grammar School? Should she keep her niqab and seek admission elsewhere? This is a question she will have to ask. This is a situation she will be faced with. Then in employment, there are women who have been discriminated against, not just for niqab, but even for hijab in Karachi and Lahore. And there are men who have been discriminated against because of beard. Now, that's not the majority of cases, but there are individual instances of like that. I remember once when I was a LUMS professor, and I won't take the name, a particular, let's say, institute invited me, but they'd never seen me, right? So they just saw the LUMS. When I showed up, they were in horror. It was one of these, I would say it was one of these military affiliated universities, but Agane, Ab didn't know what to do. They literally in front of me had a flurry of discussion, right? Which I didn't know what it was. So later then, one of the people, because amongst that was the faculty member who had invited me, they told me later, ये तो आपको देखकर इतने परेशान हो रहे थे और वो घबरा गए थे कि पता नहीं कौन आ गया है और कहते तो मौलवी आ गए तो पता नहीं क्या कहेगा लोगों को, right? तो उसी वक्त सोच रहे थे. And because what I did, I just started the lecture because I was sitting on the podium. He said, फिर आपने बात शुरू कर दी तो बस अब वो कुछ नहीं कर सकते, मगर वो आपको कभी दोबारा नहीं बुलाएंगे. I mean that. So they would never ever invite you again. And in that city there was another university attached to a different section of those four. मतलब आपका Marines नहीं होता, मतलब खैर just say Air Force, Army, and Navy, right? So I went to one of them. There was a university attached to one of the other three forces. And when somebody tried to arrange my talk there, they said, no way. And they said, why? And they said, well, he will, if he comes and speaks to our students, he will cause the Talibanization of our students. Allahu Akbar. This is Islamophobia, right? This is a perfect case of illiberal secularism, Islamophobia in civil society. So I have many anecdotes, personal and others, but I can tell you from absolute definitive proof, first-hand evidence that this exists massively in this country, right? Your Nadeem Farooq Paracha is a classic illiberal Islamophobe, but secularist, Marxist, leftist, who many of his columns, he takes, very snide attacks on issues of religion. Several writers on the Friday, I call people out because these are public, it's not ghibat. You should understand, anybody who writes anything or expresses anything in the public domain with their name will be called out in the public domain by name, all right? There are similar such authors in the Express Tribune and Dawn and the Friday Times, all right? And these are opinion shapers, all right? These are people who would never be hired at any university, a top 25 university in the United States, but they have hundreds and thousands of Twitter followers in Pakistan. There's this whole little world. There's about 1 million people basically in this country. And these are the ultra-secular, ultra-illiberal, sort of intellectual elites of this country. Not all of them fall in this category. Not all the intellectual elites are like this, but there are about 1 million of them. They all follow one another on Twitter. They all meet one another. They all host literature festivals with one another, right? And they will never allow any other opinion. If you open up the New York Times op-ed piece has somebody from the left, has somebody in the center, has somebody on the right. You open up Dawn and Friday Times. I had a relative who was a deputy editor of one of these papers. I told him I want to submit a column. He said, I spoke to the editor. The editor said, no, we are purely leftist, Marxist leading, secular paper. We would never let him submit a column. It's Allahu Akbar. Right? This is illiberal. This is not liberal journalism. This is illiberal journalism. Okay? Khair, so I think this is clear, but title ke andar baat ho gayi. I haven't even begun the slides. I managed to give you all the key points in the title. All right? But the point is that this is a very real phenomenon, a growing phenomenon in this country. All right? Actually, they don't like being called out. When I used to talk about this, they would, there was one LUM student of ours who went into her PhD in the UK. She tried to come in once to the Zainab Academy as a spy, tried to wear dupatta and pretend she was all, and I knew her to be a hardcore atheist, right? Sometimes like that, sometimes when I give a talk on this topic, there'll always one or two people. They want to know to what extent have we been identified and diagnosed, and what exactly. They actually generally are in a state of fear, actually. There's a lot of insecurity in the illiberal crowd. And they're actually terrified that their monopoly on the discourse and their monopoly on power and the monopoly on resources that they have managed to capture away, that anybody should challenge that. I knew LUMS professors who supposedly teach courses on humanities and social science, and they had child laborers in their home. And I should tell you also, because I know I'm not literally you who are in front of me, but I've seen this, and this is wrong. This is child labor. You should not be employing somebody under 16 years and depriving them from school because they're your, I don't know what you use them for, right? There was a colonel in my colony in Askari 11 who sent some kid to pick a ladder. I wanted to go tell him. You can't talk to the colonels though. The military, the retired colonel. उनकी समझने की ना मानने की सलाहियत रखते नहीं हैं. Of this type, there are many good ones, but the ones who are doing wrong things And I've noticed it's a general thing in human beings, but it's especially there in Pakistanis. I'm sorry. But it's very hard to correct them when they're doing something wrong. But that's wrong, and this is child labor, and this is an extremely illiberal. Liberals in America would be horrified if they knew what their elite friends who they meet in conferences actually do in Pakistan. A liberal who showed up here and sees their 5-star living and their 4-canal house and their, whatever you call 2,000 square foot house and their Land Cruisers, would be like, well, this is a different world, and that you have household staff who are illiterate, and you're not even doing anything to help them in their literacy. Khair, not all of them are like that. So I would also tell you that there's also a second group who are completely secular, completely irreligious, but they're not illiberal. They are liberal, they are tolerant, they are fine and comfortable with the religious people. They don't hire underage minors as employment. They're not living this extravagant lifestyle. They don't have feudal lands and go out on the Land Cruisers, Zameen par jane, and maintain that feudal fiefdom. And there's a lot of them also. I really can't tell you percentages. It may be roughly 50-50, all right? In my own personal encounters, in 20 years it's a very good data set, but it's a limited data set. But here, Gallup in these polls, they even call 1,500 people up and they give you a whole poll result on that. So there's another half which has all of that in terms of they're secular, they're not religious, but they're not illiberal and they're not Islamophobes, all right? The one thing that other half is guilty of is they don't call out the first half. They're also aware, and they'll privately, I had professors who would privately admit to me that, yeah, this person is totally gone, and they're anti-religious, and it's wrong, and it's liberal, but they don't call them out. They don't check them. They don't correct them. And this is their one flaw. Of them, there's maybe 1% who actually do that. It's almost like an unwritten compromise and an unspoken agreement between them. And you see this in different parts of the world, sort of different groups making alliances for some greater goal which they share, and then having this unspoken compromise that they won't call one another out on things that are wrong, all right? And the reason I say this, because it would be much better if they called them out. When I call them out, then it becomes a bit more, because, I'm the very thing, I'm the poster boy of what they're afraid of, right? And so then obviously that's rarely very fruitful or beneficial. So it's a problem, okay? All right. Core beliefs. So this was the slide that I discussed with you yesterday. I'm just repeating it, number one, just so you could have the slide, and number two, because after this I'm going to show you what I call rival epistemologies. So let me explain that first so you can understand this slide in light of that. Epistemology is the source and philosophy and method of knowing things, right? So obviously a religion will take its revealed sources, yani the Quran and the Sunnah, as the ultimate source of knowledge. And the arbiter, the hakam, the faisal, the decisive criterion on any other source of knowledge, all right? And somebody who doesn't bring that religious perspective will then have their own sources of knowledge and their own methods of interpreting and critically analyzing and thereafter accepting or rejecting any claim to knowledge, all right? So those are rivals. All of this is called epistemology, so they're going to be rival epistemologies. So what I wanted to do was just repeat the core beliefs and then show you a little bit about how some of these rival epistemologies may sometimes challenge some of these core beliefs. And otherwise, sometimes they don't challenge the core beliefs, but they do challenge other religious principles. So you can call that secondary aspects to religion. The core beliefs are the primary, necessary, fundamental, you can say no compromise, non-negotiable aspects of a religion, right? So obviously, if any one of the rival of epistemologies challenges any one of these, there is no sense of dialogue or engagement or negotiated compromise with that rival epistemology, okay? So the core beliefs, number one was belief in God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and as I mentioned to you, so I'm not going to repeat it in detail because I explained this to you in detail yesterday. I'm just going to read the words. Existence, that Allah ta'ala is, wujud, His oneness, that He is one, tawheed, all of His attributes, I'm sorry, there's an S missing, all of His attributes, His sifat, and all of his acts, his af'al, and by attributes and acts, sifat and af'al, I mean those that are mentioned in Quran al-Kareem. Alright? Okay, so somebody denies that no, Allah is not Ar-Rahman. So no, that's a core belief. There's no negotiation on that. There's no compromise on that. It's not that we can allow you to believe in Allah, but you don't believe that He's Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim. That's not possible. Alright? Okay. Revelation in the Quran al-Kareem, Kitabullah, Kalamullah, the divine, eternal, pre-eternal, protected, perfect, immaculate, pristine, pure, complete speech, word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alright? Kalamullah, Kitabullah. So simply I just put here, it's perfection and it's completion. Somebody says, oh, there are 10 Jews missing. We say, no, that's not possible. Somebody says, yes, it was for that time, but it's imperfect for guidance for today. We say, no, we can't, that's non-negotiable. Non-negotiable. Alright? Third, prophethood. Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam and all of the previous Anbiya and Mursaleen that we know of, at least in the Quran and Sunnah, the perfection of each and every one of them, Ismatul Anbiya, and the perfection of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and the finality, Khatm Nabuwah, in every single sense, in every single aspect, real or imagined or hypothetical or possible. Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the absolute final last seal of prophethood, nubuwah, and messengerhood, risala. Again, something we explained yesterday. And fourth is the hereafter. So one example is if some, like for example, a very nice, sweet, gentle, lovely Marxist professor says that Muhammad ibn Abdullah was not a prophet, he was a social reformer, and I love him for his social reforms. We say we love you for loving him, we love you for recognizing that he was a social reformer, but he was a prophet. This is not negotiable for us. This is not going to work. It's not a compromise we can come to agree to. Okay, yes, you're being nice, you call him social reformer. Okay, we also meet you halfway and say, yes, he was only social reformer. As an A. Alright? Okay. Fourth core belief, hereafter. Right? And hereafter, number one, resurrection, that there is life after death. Number two, that there is a day of judgment. And number three, that, I've sort of used the word again, but that there's an akhirah, an eternal life. Maybe it would have been better actually to put that perhaps, resurrection, day of judgment, and then comma, eternal life. Be that Jannah or Jahannam, as the case may be. Allahumma inna nas'aluka al-jannata bighayri hisab wa na'udhu bika min an-nar. All right. Okay, now, the rival epistemologies. So we were going to do these line by line with you, but Bismillah, you see all of them. There are others also. There are others, but these are sort of some words that are bantered about. And again, these are words that these sort of movements or ideologies do use for themselves. I should be, this is not, I'm not applying labels on someone. These are the self-professed identification terms that are used by them themselves. All right? So there's good and bad in each. Okay, I'm going to tell you something which may actually surprise you, may shock some of you, may disturb some of you actually. Number one, obviously, there will be a good in all of them in the following sense, that same good is to be found in Deen of Islam. Right? So we'll say in cases like that, there's a lot of, and in fact we need to expand those horizons of commonality. Always remember this when you're talking about true, liberal, plural, peaceful coexistence, which Islam also advocates. When you're talking about true, liberal, pluralist, peaceful, mutual coexistence in a non-violent way, right? The first step is you must expand. You must identify, discover, explore, and expand all the horizons of commonality. And there are a lot of things that liberals don't know. There are a lot of things that secular liberals, because they're secular, so they're not interested in religion, so fair enough, but they don't know that there are many things in Islam that actually are in alignment with the same values that they hold, right? So that lack of knowledge, or if you want to be more explicit, ignorance, causes a gap between two communities, which are secular, non-religious, maybe non-Muslim, maybe atheist all the way, liberals, and religious practicing Muslims, right? So that's the first thing. You must discover and expand the horizons of commonality. It's only when you maximally identify and expand them, then you will be successful at somehow navigating the areas of difference. So a big problem that we have now is that people try to go to the second step first, right? And they try to discuss the differences without having done the first step, which is understanding and realizing the things that are in common. Okay? That's not the thing that was going to shock you, by the way. That's something that I explained. That there's good in all of these, and that is a type of good that is already found in Islam. The second thing I'm going to tell you that is going to shock some of you, that in a certain sense, it won't shock you after I explain it, but let me say it in a way that it shocks you, just so I can have some fun with you. In a certain sense, there is good in all of these that is not found in Islam. Now, what does that mean? Because most of us, we normally think that no, all good is found in Islam, right? There's a certain good in them, in a sense, that is not found in Islam, and that is a kind of good in them, and I'll give you some examples, that is not explicitly found in Islam, but it doesn't go against Islam in any way, right? So for example, if I'm trying to work with, let's say, poor Muslims and poor Hindus in India, and I'm trying to explain to the poor Muslims that the poor Hindus of the, so similar thing I talked to you about yesterday, that the poor Hindus of the untouchable caste, you have to view them as your fellow human being. Now that's an Islamic teaching, but how to explain it to them, how to talk to them. There will be certain things in the contemporary literature and discourse on humanism that is a very good way to help explain it to them. So the concept is there in Islam, but maybe the method could be adopted from them. So this is something I explained to you, those of you who were here, and I keep referring to these earlier courses. I don't know if it was the second or the first winter study course on the concept of bid'ah. And so bid'ah, when I was explaining to you bid'ah or heretical innovation in deen, that there's two aspects in deen. One is the content and one is the method, all right? To add anything to the content of deen, that is obviously a bid'ah, right? And that is what Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam meant when he said, so I will say to you in English using my terminology, that any added content to deen is an innovation, right? And every innovation will lead a person to the fire of Jahannam, okay? All right. And there's a word, from hadath and sudur and muhdath, khair. But anyway, okay. But if you remember in the Bid'ah presentation, we taught that method, there will be new methods that are added to deen. Methods that were not there at the time of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and not there at the time of Sahaba Kiram radiyallahu ta'ala anhum ajmain. For example, the overwhelming majority of young children in Pakistan, their first encounter in how to read Quran is with a small little booklet called Nurani Qaida, and they are taught Abba, Abbu, Abbi. There's no sense that Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used this method to teach Sahaba, or Sahaba Ikram, more relevant, Sahaba Ikram used this method to teach non-Arab tabi'in, right? So what does it mean? You have something that did happen in history. Arab teaching non-Arab how to read Quran, and it happened not through this method. Now, if you were some hyper-literalist, you would say, well, today, if it has happened, we must use their method. And the only reason the hyper-literalists don't make the call about this is because there is no historical record of how the Arab Tabi'in taught the non-Arab Tabi'in this science, right? You can call it, it's even before Tajweed, just qiraat or, just basic huruf, okay? All right. So the good in here may be a certain method. So for example, if you read something in a book of a humanist, he may have a method of explaining the common a common feeling that humanity should have for one another, and that could be a very good method to explain to that poor Muslim and poor Hindu in India how they should view one another as common human beings. The condition, however, for adopting a method from any one of these rival epistemologies, and because they remain rival, because their core fundamental assumptions are different from the core beliefs that I put on the previous slide. So maybe let's explain the word rival. Each and every one of these, secularism, liberalism, humanism, modernism, has its own core. Like we had our core beliefs that I showed you. They have their own core fundamental assumptions. And those core fundamental assumptions at a very essential level are rivals to the core beliefs of religion. Okay? So when you're evaluating a method, not content, method, from a rival epistemology, number one, the condition is that there must be nothing in that method that contradicts or goes against the content of deen or the core beliefs of deen. Second, that method must be employed in a manner that is in service of the content of deen and the core beliefs of deen. So I give you this example, that it is in the belief of deen that the Muslim and Hindu at a human level, not that the Muslims should say, okay, Hinduism is also correct religion or equally valid as me, not like that, but at a human level they should be able to peacefully coexist. Like, for example, one method that Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is documented in hadith as using is once there was a janazah, or the funeral procession of a Jew passing, and Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam stood up, right? Now, actually, if you know, that is not actually the method in our deen anyway. If a janazah passes, it's not in Islamic teaching that you must necessarily stand up, right? Yes, if you want to go and join and help, right? But the Prophet ﷺ adopted that as an instructional method to teach his companions that it's a human janazah which is going. And we have respect for that person as a human being, right? Now, you may not be able to do that. Well, it did perfect in this case because, as you know, Hindus cremate. So there's not going to be any funeral procession janazah, funeral procession of a Hindu, right? But you may find some other method. I think you understand now from this example, and I will show you a bit more. Okay? So it's in that sense that there may be good. There is no good in them in terms of their fundamental assumptions versus our core beliefs, or their content versus the content of deen, but there may be certain secondary things in them that are methods that don't contradict our core beliefs and can even be used in service of our core beliefs. Okay? Let me give you a legal example, right? Let's just pretend, it'd be a big leap for you, but pretend that Pakistan really wanted to enact the ideal welfare, social justice state. Okay. So you can't only just go back and look at the time of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You would also study Sweden, you would study Norway, you would study other social welfare models in the last 100 years, and there may be certain methods, certain economic principles, certain laws, certain statutes that you would take from, any other, maybe even a non-Muslim country, because that method doesn't contradict Islam, and rather you will employ it in the service of Islam. But strictly speaking, that method cannot be found in the Quran and Sunnah. All right? Now you understood the sentence that there may be good in them, a certain kind of good in a certain sense that may not even be found in Islam. And then already you understood that there's a first type of good that is actually already there in Islam. So there are two types of good in them. And as I've shown you on the slide, the bad, there's also going to be a bad in them. And that I've already hinted to you at. That is almost all, not always, even some of the core fundamental assumptions sometimes are actually the same as core beliefs and core teachings of deen. But a lot of their core fundamental assumptions. All right? So let's look a little bit at each one, and then we'll talk a little bit about the good and bad of each. Now, again, like I told you yesterday, every single session, half-day session, is an entire semester course. Has the potential, if taught properly, to be an entire semester course. Just to teach what secularism is and then its history, and then to try to do a comparative assessment of secularism with Islam, and then identify both types of good and the one bad, that itself is a semester course. All right? And it's unfortunate, again, this is not the way humanities and social sciences is taught in this country, or anywhere really in the Muslim world, except for maybe a few individual professors, right? But so today will be maybe a sample taste for you how Muslims should engage in humanities and social sciences. All right? Okay. Secularism. So, in fact, once in Karachi, now I remember there was that hall, right? Was it Clifton? No, Royal Valdale maybe. I don't know. I gave a whole session just on this. Just on this one slide was just whole 2 hours, or I don't know, 3 hours just on this, right? Here, okay. I'm going to go very quickly through the history because that doesn't concern me. What I'm really concerned with is current contemporary forms of secularism in the Muslim world, which I've already hinted at before. But very quickly, the origins of secularism begin in Europe, and it is originally an idea that actually Islam would be very happy with, and that is that the corrupt and oppressive and unjust monarchies of Europe were hijacking the Catholic Church for legitimacy, right? And that's why the secularists called for a separation of church and state, because a great number, not all, but a great number of Catholic clergy were involved in the corruption of those absolute monarchies. So to weed out corruption in religion is also a very Islamic concept, right? So they advocated for initially what they called this famous line you all would have heard, separation of church and state. But remember that has a historical context. This is what they meant, all right? Separation of not the morals and values and ethics of Christianity. The morals and values and ethics of Christianity should be part of politics. What they meant was the separation of the corrupt, rent-seeking, all right, Catholic clergy from the entire political domain. You have to understand, unpack the statement, okay? And there was a whole series of revolutions in Europe, and that's a whole history, okay? Ultimately, obviously, as you all know, if anyone's been to Europe, they were completely successful, right? Even in America, a priest, you've never seen a priest who is a senator, or a priest who is a governor, or a priest who is a member of Congress, or a priest who has a cabinet position, let alone any priest who becomes vice president or president, all right? Although technically it's allowed, it's not like it's forbidden by law, but secularism is very embedded, all right? Secularism then went to next step, and that step is perhaps then more sort of the bad, if you will, or sort of rival to what Islam would say, and that was, okay, once you've removed, now I'm going to change the word from church, once you've removed religion from the state, the second step is to remove religion from society. American secularism doesn't do this entirely, but there have been discussions, for example, on public prayer in school. But like I told you, continental European secularism does this, whether it's hijab or minarets or whatever. Remove religion from society. Okay? Then it went a third step when it had done that, and the third step was remove religion from the concept of humanity. And so this is known as secular humanism. So the very simple notion is, the very simple sentence is that to be a good human being, you do not have to be religious at all. To be a good human being has nothing to do with belief in any of those core beliefs. You can be a good human being without anything on this slide. You can be a perfectly good human being while completely denying everything on this slide. So that was then to remove religion from the very concept of humanity. Do you understand? You can be a perfectly good human being, secular humanism. If you deny the existence of God, you deny the oneness of God, you deny His attribute and acts, you deny any and every aspect of revelation, you deny any and every prophethood, you deny any concept of hereafter, you can still be a perfectly good human being. So it's a different definition of humanity. Different from what? A different understanding of humanity as a human, as an essentially spiritual creature who is the creation of God, whose purpose on earth is what? وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, whose core purpose on earth is to know and love and obey and worship and serve God and His creation for the sake of God. That's a religious understanding of humanity. The secular humanist concept of humanity takes all of that out. All right? So now you can clearly see why that was labeled then here a rival epistemology. That's not just a rival, that's in complete contradiction, complete opposition. In fact, it is an attempt to do a complete negation of Islam and religion. Okay? All right. Second is liberalism. So the history of liberalism, even in Western philosophy courses, they often start with John Stuart Mill, all right? And so liberalism has to do with the idea of liberty and freedom, right? Later on it will come to this discourse of human rights, but it starts with the notion of individual liberty and freedom. So there's a very famous line in John Stuart Mill's work, which they call Mill's principle of liberalism, right? And that is very simple. They call it the harm principle. And that is the core foundation of liberalism. And that is what? That he wrote, that every individual should be at complete freedom and liberty to do whatever they want, as long as it does not harm another individual or society. Every individual should be at complete freedom and liberty to do anything they want, as long as it does not harm another individual or society. Okay? So that is the notion of, so when I told you true liberalism, you put a minaret, you're not harming any individual, not harming society. Putting a minaret is fine in true liberalism, right? You want your child to get a circumcision. I mean, they may try to say you're harming that individual, right? But medical science has shown that it cannot be categorically called a harm, right? Your woman wants to wear hijab, right? So what happens is they change the definition of what is harm later, because the ultra-secularist view all religion is harm. Original liberalism, John Stuart Mill didn't think like that. He may not have been religious,